Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the monthly meeting at Sitaram Bhartiya Research Institute and the young enthusiastic team of Sitaram Bharti. It was really nice to interact with them, so enthusiastic about the monthly meeting. And we are lucky at the moment, little away from COVID, a little respite from COVID. So we have started doing a lot of activities. And before Monica reads the monthly report, I just wanted to share with you all what new things we have done in the last month. We have started a PG forum for daily PGs. So everybody is welcome to join that. They can contact Dr. Sunita Malik. Any institute has DNB students and they want to be part of it. And we are becoming popular. NGOs are contacting us for public forums, and we are having a public forum every fortnight. IMA, DMA, DMC are contacting us to have program with us. So this month was very, very hectic because we had so many activities for the World Population Day. We started with an Antakshari, a different event besides the academic. Then we had a quiz for youngsters. We had poster competition for ASHA workers, sisters, and doctors. And Monica in her report will show you that how well these people have done. They've done very good work. So I think if the third wave does not come, then we should be able to do much more work than what we are doing. And after Monica's report, I will give it over to Nikita and Rinku to start their monthly meeting. So I think now it is over to Dr. Monica, who would be sharing her screen with you soon, and will give the monthly report. So Monica, over to you.
8 to 6.
Good afternoon, everybody. Sorry for that technical delay. I would now like to present the secretary report. Can you see my screen? So we started the month with our, this report starts from the previous month's AOGD meeting, in which wonderful cases were presented by AIMS on 25th of June. Then we had AOGD associated with RCOG, AICC North Zone, where we did webinar on twin pregnancy on 27th June. Then there was a CME and IHCP by Kasturba Gandhi Hospital in association with AOGD and NARCHI on 28th June. Then we had, this time we have grouped the programs under the various subcommittees who have held programs this month. The Urogynecology subcommittee did two wonderful programs. One, which was a very, very well appreciated program on cosmetic gynecology on 30th June. Then we had a seminar on, a webinar on urological injuries during cesarean and gynecological surgeries and fistula repair on 14th of July. We then had various programs done by Reproductive Endocrinology Committee on adolescent PCOS and precocious puberty with DGF Outer Delhi on 30th June, impact of COVID and endocrinopathies on pregnancy on 7th June. Then there was a program on PCOS and infertility on 10th July. Another one on recurrent pregnancy loss, which was in association with Fetal Medicine and Genetics Committee on 18th July. Then thyroid disorders in women's life with Foxy on 21st July. And then on Fertility Day, there was a nice program done by in association with Haryana SR and DJF Outer Delhi on 25th July, and a similar program on infertility, a multidisciplinary approach on 25th July. Then programs which were done under the ambit of Safe Motherhood Committee were impact of COVID and endocrinopathies on pregnancy with IM in North Delhi branch on 7th July. Then there was an interesting program on infamous obstetric triad, recognition and action on 7th July, and comprehensive abortion care, plugging the gaps on 16th July. Our oncology subcommittee did a wonderful cervical cancer screening program in association with Action Cancer Hospital, Shimla, on 10th July. Then our fetal medicine and genetics subcommittee did two nice programs. One was on current updates on antenatal and postnatal management of RH-ISO immunization on 8th July. And another one, which I've already told, in association with the reproductive endocrinology committee on recurrent pregnancy loss and on 18th July. Then our adolescent subcommittee did various programs, including there was one on role of calcium and vitamin D in pregnancy and lactation on 30th June. There was a nice public forum in association with the DGF and the NGO WOW on 10th July. And then a series of 3 webinars on 13th, 20th and 27th July on various aspects of PCOS. Now, adolescent subcommittee also did a wonderful poster competition on the occasion of World Population Day and the fortnight of population celebration, population stabilization celebration, where we invited various ASHA workers, nursing officers, and of course the doctors as well for poster competition, for posters on contraception. And it was a very well organized and well attended program. Our endoscopy committee did a webinar on basic series of on gynae endoscopy on 22nd July. Endometriosis subcommittee did a webinar on adolescent endometriosis, which was also very much appreciated, and it was combined with one quiz as well, which was well attended on 9th July. Our rural health committee did a very innovative program this time, which was one of its kind, which AODG took the initiative, which was an Antakshari competition to celebrate the Doctors' Day on 1st July. We had association this month with IMA, and we did 3 different programs with the South Delhi branch on the occasion of celebrating that first week of July, which was Safe Motherhood Week. So on 2nd July, 6th July and 23rd July, we did various programs in association with them. Then we did a very interesting public forum on contraceptive awareness on 3rd July, in which we had invited the program director of this Directorate of Family Welfare and all experts from the field of family welfare, where it was such nicely attended, almost more than 5,000 attendance, and it was simultaneously channeled on YouTube and Facebook as well. Various ASHA workers attended it. Then we did another, very pertinent topic of the day, which is COVID vaccination and we invited Dr. Nija Bhatla, Dr. Pratima Mittal, and Dr. Monica Rana from the Directorate of Family Welfare again, who have been very instrumental in in getting the COVID vaccination included for pregnant females. And so all the doubts were cleared from the doctors fraternity on this day in this forum. Then, of course, across Delhi, various programs were conducted under the Population Stabilization Week. Then we had cake on 17th July. We did a quiz competition for our Yuva AOGD members, which was a very nicely attended program by all the PGs of Delhi. And it was an online quiz. We then did a CME on menopause on 24th July. few other public forums were on incontinence and cervical cancer awareness. And now these three things on your screen are the, the winning posters from the doctors fraternity, which were invited as a part of celebration of Popularization Stabilization Week. And so the first prize went to Dr. Kanika Chopra from LHMC. The second prize went to Dr. Aditi Chawla, who's a postgraduate student from Safdarjung Hospital. And the third prize went to Dr. Sujata Mittal from Delhi.
They are here, Monica. If you want, they can.
Coming down to the achievements of our AOGD members, we had somehow, apologies, missed mentioning Dr. Alka Kriplani's name in last month's secretary report. She had won the prestigious Vidya Vibhushan Award by ICOG. And as we have already apprised, congratulations once again to all our AOGD members who've been shining bright in FOXI and ICOG. Dr. Ashok Kumar, as you all know, has been elected as, and he has taken over office as ICOG secretary for 3 years. Dr. Amala Srivastav and Dr. Nija Bhatla have now become ICOG governing council members from this year onwards. Dr. Richa Sharma has been installed as chairperson FOXI MTP committee, and there is a ICOG appreciation award given to Dr. Dinesh Kansal for her contribution to the ICOG endoscopy courses, and also her contribution to the book on ICOG on endoscopy, which will soon be coming out. There were a few publication releases as well this month, which were appreciated during the FOXI president outgoing and incoming FOXI president orations as well. And special mention to this clinical practice guidelines, in which Dr. Pratibha Mittal and Dr. Nija Bhatla were the important contributors. In association with the National Neonatology Forum, this publication has come out onto the right of your screen. Amongst the forthcoming events, we'll be having masterclass on gestational trophoblastic disease by Oncology Committee on 31st July, that is tomorrow. A webinar on IVF pregnancies, how they are different, by Infertility Committee on 3rd August. Decrease cesarean rates by NARCHI and AOGD collaboration on 4th August. Then there'll be a program on reigning in cesarean pandemic by Safe Motherhood Committee. QI committee will be doing a workshop on 5th and 6th August. There'll be a panel discussion on pregnancy with thyroid diseases by multidisciplinary committee in association with DGF Southwest. And Infertility Committee will do another program on 8th August. There'll be a webinar by Infertility Committee by DGF Forum North under AOGD on 18th August. Activity by Endoscopy Committee again on 19th August, and Ovarian Cancer by Oncology Committee on 21st August. Safe Motherhood Committee will be doing a webinar on 26th August, and our next monthly clinical meeting will be at Army Hospital, which was scheduled to be on 27th August, though I have mentioned the date, but because of NARCHI conference, which will be held on 28th and 29th August, we will be soon intimating the date, and most probably it will be 3rd of September. So we'll meet next on 3rd September. With that, I invite Dr. Rinku ma'am to take over the proceedings for the monthly clinical meeting.
Thank you, Dr. Monica. And we have a multicolored assortment of clinical goodies. But just before we start, we'll have a few words from our legendary Dr. V.L. Bhargav. I can see Dr. Renu Mishra has also joined us. So a few words from Dr. V.L. Bhargav, ma'am, please, before we start.
Thank you, Dr. Rinku. And good evening to everybody, and welcome to this AOGD meeting. I'm sure you'll enjoy all the subjects, but especially gender dysphoria, because where 3 specialties are required to solve one patient. So thank you very much. And I think I'll hand over to Dr. Rinku to carry on. Dr. Rinku? डॉक्टर रिंकू के पास
Yes,
पहुंचा?
ma'am. Yes, ma'am. I'm just making it the reading view. Can you see my screen? Can all of you see my screen?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes? Yeah. So I was a little apprehensive about this topic, gender dysphoria, although Achla ma'am really encouraged me. She was sweet enough to say, you know, there'll be a lot of interest. And on the eve of Pride Month in June, I found this ACOG tweet which says that OBS-GYNs should be prepared to assist or refer transgender individuals for routine treatment and screening, as well as hormonal and surgical therapies to care for these patients. You will probably, some of you will know that our own guidelines like ACOG and RCOG have standard clinical care pathways for transgender population. And it is time that most of us understand, be sensitive about the care of transgender individuals in our community. So gender dysphoria, you've heard of gender dysphoria from times immemorial. You've heard of Shikhandi, who was born in a female body, but had the mind and brain of a male. And you know, he was plotting the death of Bhishma Pitamaha. So this incongruence that you find between the mind and the body, that means you're born as a particular sex, but your mind and your brain does not agree with that sex. And this is called gender incongruence or gender dysphoria. And there can be severe psychological distress because of this condition, and a lot of people contemplate suicide. A lot of people, you know, you heard of a lot of celebrities who've changed their genders. This is the picture of Malayali actress, who is now a very famous trans woman actress of the Malayalam film industry. So sex can be chromosomal, gonadal, hormonal, as Sir will elucidate later on. But what a lot of us don't understand is that there is a sexual recognition in the brain, and that may not always match with the sex, the phenotypic sex or the gonadal sex. Some of you are familiar with the concept of, you know, a lot of you in fact are familiar with intersex and disorders of sex development. But these two things are not the same, although some people who are intersex could also have gender dysphoria. Now, what is the role of a gynecologist? I think it is time that we set up gender neutral clinics. We understand, sensitize, and get sensitized to this concept. And we are able to, you know, refer these individuals to appropriate colleagues, understand the standardized care for gender affirming hormone therapy, like those who need cross hormones, and refer the individuals to the people who can do the surgery, to the skilled personnel who can do the surgery. A very, very important part of the care is giving right contraceptive advice, because even after gender reassignment surgeries, a lot of these individuals will need contraceptive advice, will need, you know, preventive care in terms of preventing sexually transmitted diseases and cancers. And very, very important is fertility advice. A lot of these people will need to, you know, get their oocytes frozen or do sperm banking before they go for reassignment surgeries. So we in our hospital have done some progress in this field. There was a multidisciplinary team which was made in 2005. Sorry? Okay, sorry. In 2005, a multidisciplinary team was made under the leadership of Dr. S.V. Kotwal, and he, along with psychiatrists, endocrinologists, gynecologists, you know, formed a team where a journey of care for these transgender individuals was done. Sir will tell us more about this. I don't think Sir needs any introduction. He's been a part of our family for the last 20 years, bailed us out of many, many difficult surgical situations. And over to you, Sir, please. I'll start with your slides, sir.
Okay, well, firstly, good evening, and I'm really happy to be here. And with this forum, I can see it's a very dynamic forum looking at the achievements over the last month. Also, I noticed that I am the only man in this gathering, so I must mind my P's and Q's. Can I have my first slide?
Can you see, sir?
I can't, I can see you, Rinku, I can't see the slide.
Shivam,
Okay, so here we go. I am grateful to Rinku. She's done more than half of my job. So gender identity dysphoria is not something that can be confused with intersex, which is something that we commonly encounter in our day-to-day practice. Now, this idea, to be very honest, I was a fairly senior urologist when I came across my first case of gender identity dysphoria, which means, of course, that I'm ancient now. But this was in the 2000s when we started a male sexual health clinic. And to be very honest, when a patient called and asked for an appointment because he had GID, I didn't have a clue. Because our medical education does not prepare us for this, neither does our post-graduation give us any information about gender identity dysphoria. So it is important to know a little bit. I mean, we started this program in the early 2000s, and I did my first case in November 2005. This was the first integrated scientific program in the country. And though people have been doing this kind of surgery on and off, but as sporadic cases. So it was nice to start off something new. And it's been a long journey. As Rinku said, we were firstly lucky to have two psychiatrists who had specialized in adolescent health and who had worked in gender clinic abroad. And therefore, they brought their expertise, and I think their inputs were most valuable. And then, of course, you have a endocrinologist. We call upon Rinku or Swati to help out with the hysterectomies. And we did have a plastic surgeon for a while, but gradually we started doing it. So can I have the next one, please? Next slide. Yeah, so certain things which are basic. See, it must be emphasized that gender is different from sex. Now, gender is something that arises in the brain, and sex is something that arises in the gonads. That gender identity is innate, it is non-negotiable. That means it can never be changed, either by punishment, reward, training, yoga, what have you, drugs. Nothing can ever change gender identity. The third important fact that I want to start off with is that the only indication for surgery, sex reassignment surgery, or gender reaffirmation surgery, as it is now called, is gender identity dysphoria. There is no other indication for sex reassignment surgery. Next slide, please. Next, please. Can I have the next slide? Next, please. Can I have the next slide?
I think slide is not moving. It's not moving.
Yes. So the transgenders were known for a long time. It is not a new disease, but it only came to light fairly recently when this gentleman called Harry Benjamin published a book called The Transgender Phenomenon, and this really woke up the world. Harry Benjamin, by the way, was not a surgeon, he was not a gynecologist, he was an endocrinologist. And therefore, the book that he put out is really a landmark. Now, for long, there has been a controversy whether this is a mental condition or it is a medical condition or a social condition. And you'll be surprised that the two leading authorities, that is WHO and the American Psychiatric Association, till the 90s, they had different views. For example, the Psychiatric Association held that it was a mental condition, and till 1994, the WHO still held that it is not. It's only now that it's accepted that it is a medical condition which requires treatment. Now, is there any governing authority for transgender health? Yes, there is WPATH, and this is our textbook today. It is called World Practitioners Association of Transgender Health. And this puts out several editions, and this is now currently the standard of care. Next, please. If we're going to take very long if this goes on like this. Can we change? Yes, so as I said, that the perception of transgender has changed from the time that I was a medical student, regarded as a sexual perversion in the past, and then as a sexual aberration, and now we regard it as an alternate sexuality. Now, is there a biological basis for it? Yes, there is a biological basis for transgender identity, and I'm going to show you just a few slides, not too many. Next, please. Next, please. We're taking too long between slides. Yeah, so Rinku has partly identified how do you identify that the person you meet is a man or a woman. Phenotypically, does he look like a man or a woman? Does he have the chromosomes of a man or a woman? Does he have the hormones of a man or a woman? Does he have the gonads of a man or a woman? But what is more important now is what is his brain sex or what is his neurological sex? And that identifies his gender. So gender identity is actually neuronal origin. Next, please. Next, please.
I don't know, the slide is not moving. Yeah,
I don't know, because at this rate,
Sir, can you see?
yeah, so let's get back to human embryology where it all started. As we know that embryos are all hermaphrodites to begin with, and that the default setting of the embryo is really female. What makes a male is only this SRY gene on the Y chromosome that determines whether it's a male or not. But the important fact is, and this is something that must be stressed, that genitalia develop in the 7th to 8th week of pregnancy, and the brain develops in the second half of pregnancy. So therefore, there is a mismatch. If there is a mismatch between development of the genitals and development of the brain, this can account for the transgender phenomenon. Now, how do we know this? Because there have been a number of investigations, and now hormone receptors have been identified in the brain. And therefore, the brain, to some extent, is influenced by the hormones produced by the genitalia. But if there is a mismatch, this accounts for gender identity dysphoria. I shall show you. Next. Next, please. No, I think you missed a slide. You missed a slide.
After
Did you,
that one.
did you miss a slide? Yeah,
Sir-
so which is the sexual part of the brain? The limbic system is the primitive part of the brain, and this is what we call the sexual brain. It is the amygdala and the, oh dear. Yes, the amygdala and the limbic system, they control emotion. So in the hypothalamus, there are two basic things: hypothalamus and the basal nuclei. So therefore, hypothalamus controls hunger, thirst, sleep, body rhythm, sexual urge. The interstitial nuclei of the hypothalamus control the sexual behavior. And there are hormone receptors which are responsible for dimorphism. You know, the limbic system of a male differs from the limbic system of a female, and that is why the limbic system is termed as dimorphic. And what makes it dimorphic is the hormones. So the brain develops under the influence of the hormones, but these hormone receptors, both androgen and estrogen, have been identified in the brain, and these are responsible for dimorphism. Next, please. I'll try to go over as fast as I can because I'm running out of time. Rinku, you have given me 20 minutes. I can't finish. So how do we know that this is so? Like blood banks and various other kinds of banks that we are familiar with, there are brain banks. And in brain banks, the brains of people whose entire medical history, medication, social behavior, psychiatric behavior, everything is very well known and catalogued. Such brains are accepted. For example, brains of people with Alzheimer's, with dementia. So this is the field of basic research, and brain banks exist all over the world. You'll be happy to know that India also has got one blood bank, but the oldest blood banks were in the UK and in the Netherlands. Now, the work done at the, so this is the post-mortem evidence. So studies in the Netherlands blood bank have shown significant dimorphism, that is difference between male and female, in the bed nucleus of stria terminalis, inferior nucleus of the anterior hypophysis, corpus callosum, and this other structure which is far removed from your specialty and mine. But these are neurological studies, neuroanatomy studies, and which tell us how people who have a predisposition or a dysphoria will behave. Next, please. Next, please. Now, can one tell in a living individual that this person is likely to be transgender? This is a very interesting study done in 2008. And in vivo studies is functional MRI. So this is a person who is walking, talking, and you can, with functional MRI, you can pick out the activity in the brain which lights up on a functional MRI. Now we have, say, 3 individuals. We have a heterosexual woman, we have a male to female transgender, and a heterosexual man. Now, if this individual, these 3 individuals are given these pheromones to inhale, that means only smell. Now, androgen, just androgen inhalation or androgynous pheromones, they cause only an olfactory stimulation in the males and in the hypothalamus. But in this heterosexual woman and in the male to female transgender, it is the hypothalamic stimulation that takes place. That means if you see these diagrams, this is what lights up in the woman. So an androgenic inhalation given to these 3 individuals will light up in different territories, and that of the heterosexual woman and the male to female transgender are the same. So though this fellow is a male, but he is stimulated by androgenic hormones and vice versa. Estrogenic pheromones stimulate in the opposite way. So estrogenic hormones will cause only olfactory stimulation, that means only a smell. But the hypothalamus gets excited in the heterosexual male. So this was a landmark study, and this actually put us on to a lot of brain research. There's been a tremendous amount of work done on functional MRI, and this is just an early example that I'm putting to you. Next, please. Next, please. Next, please. So to sum up, I mean, I have not got into too much detail and I have not quoted from literature because otherwise it will get endless and boring. The take-home message is that gender identity and gender orientation originate in the brain. That in transsexuals, the normal sex differentiation of certain hypothalamic networks is altered by cerebral programming in utero before the newborn takes his first breath. And this is very important because the gender identity is decided before the newborn takes his first breath. It cannot be changed thereafter. Next, please. Next, please. So Rinku asked me to show some slides of operative pictures which may be of interest. Next, please. So how does one treat a transgender? Now, as I said before, that the gender is inborn, it cannot be changed. This is in the mind. So you cannot change the mind of a person either by punishment or reward or preaching or religion or anything like that. So all that one can do is adjust the body to the mind, and that in a nutshell is the aim of sex reassignment surgery. Mind you, every transgender does not require surgery, and this is a point that requires to be stressed. A lot of them require only counseling. A lot of them will require only hormones, and a small minority of them will ultimately come to surgery. Now, how does one manage a transsexual or a transgender individual? The standard of care, as I said before, is this World Professional Association of Transgender Health. We are currently in the 7th edition. It's a very long text, but the important thing is that the diagnosis is always made by a mental health professional, not by any other specialist. So I have a number of patients coming to me All of them are assessed by the mental health professional, a psychiatrist, or a trained psychologist who has worked in a gender clinic. Unfortunately, most psychiatrists do not want to treat these individuals. They're quite happy treating anxieties and depressions and what have you, manias and so on. But they're the only people who are specially trained who can treat this. Once the psychiatrist makes a diagnosis and says, all right, this man requires only hormones or only counseling, or he requires surgery, then the entire process is set into motion. The first stop is with the endocrinologist. So the endocrinologist will give female hormones to the male individual or male to the female, and his role is very important. But perhaps in all this, the most important is the mental health professional, because they take their time to make up a diagnosis. They might require multiple sittings. It's only when they concur that this is required does the further treatment proceed. Then there is real life experience. What is real life experience? It means that we do not want to create misfits in society. That individual must be accepted in that gender role by society. So real life experience means living as the gender of choice for at least a period of 1 year. And finally, the patient comes to me for reassignment surgery. So the entire process takes about 18 to 24 months before this individual comes to surgery. And that is the basic standard of care laid down by WHO. Next, please. Next, please.
1 second, sir. Can you see, sir?
Yeah, now we have. Now let's start with male to female surgery. Male to female surgery is easier because it is a one-step surgery, and it takes me about, say, 5 hours or so. It consists of what? Removal of the testis, which is the source of the male hormones. There are various techniques of vaginoplasty. The one that I'm going to briefly show you is the penoscrotal inversion technique. The other is you can construct a vagina out of the sigmoid, colovaginoplasty. Now, of the two, the penoscrotal inversion is much, much better because it's a fully innervated skin and the person can have erogenous sensations. Whereas in colovaginoplasty, there is no sensation in the vagina. Besides, the colon secretes a lot of mucus, which is very inconvenient, and therefore nowhere in the world will anybody recommend sigmoid vaginoplasty as the primary treatment of choice. This is done in treatment failures where the penoscrotal inversion fails, largely because of the patient not doing the dilatations. Subsequently, and we do not advise breast implants for at least 6 months after the surgery, because whatever change has to take place in the breast grow, a lot of people do not require breast implants, and breast implants not recommended before 6 months post-surgery. This is done by the plastic surgeons. I don't do it. There are miscellaneous other surgeries that are done, but they're done abroad. We do not currently have, it's not widespread to do laryngoplasty or chinplasty and so on and so forth. But of course, laser depilation procedure is very common. And all these people go to laser clinics because they've got this lead period when they are getting their endocrine treatment and real life experience. And in this process, they undergo various body changes. Next, please. Next, please.
Can you see, sir?
No, I can't. Yes. So this is the technique that I use, and this, you see, it is not enough to use the penile skin because you always fall short of skin, and therefore you require part of the scrotal skin also. The scrotal flap is turned down, the testes are bared and removed. Next. We'll go over this a little fast, Rinku, because I don't want to waste time into telling you things which you might not be interested in knowing. Can we go to the next?
Yes, sir. I think it's taking a little time to reach you.
Yeah, so the most important is this dissection of the perineum to form the vagina. And this is between the rectum and the bladder. This has to be done very carefully because this is a space that really does not exist. You go along between the two leaves of the Denon valgus fascia. There's a rectum behind and the bladder in front. And as they say, we go between wind and water. and that's where we create this space. It must be sufficiently deep to allow for subsequent shrinkage. So we always endeavor to have at least 6 inches of vaginal depth. And this is very important. Next, please. Next, please.
Has it reached you, sir?
It's coming by snail mail.
Yes, it's slow. I don't know how. Taking
Yeah,
time to.
I have put all these in a composite picture. Now you can see that the penis is degloved, maintaining its blood supply and nerve supply. The corpora are divided. You can see the penile skin flap and the vaginal, the scrotal skin flap forming the vagina. Part of the glans is used with its nerve supply and blood supply to form the clitoris. And at the end of surgery, this is what it happens, what it looks like once the vagina is inserted in place. And these incisions will be closed to form the labia majora. Next, please. Next, please. Yes, no, the one after that. And this is the final result. This is immediately after the end of the surgery. And this is no.
Okay, the one before this, sir?
Yeah, this one.
Yeah.
So this is now at the end. No, please don't change it. This is again the vaginal cavity being dissected. Okay, next. The one that you showed just now. Yeah, so this is the end result. As you can see, there's no scar showing. This is the same person at the end of healing. The scars do not show. The aesthetic appearance is fairly lifelike. And this is what a person which always looks like. Next, please. The important thing is, next, please, is vaginal dilatation. So we make these dilators ourselves, and then we give a dilator to each patient, and she has to, most important thing is she must dilate for half an hour a day, twice a day for a period of 2 months, which I'm very, very sticky about. And it is those people who do not dilate regularly who get into trouble because the vagina shrinks. And therefore, this dilatation is most important. And this must go on till sexual start.
So we can't hear you properly, sir. Sir? We lost, sir, no?
He has lost his connection.
So the phone button? Try कर बोलो एक बार
सर एक बार फिर से ट्राई आ गया क्या हाँ ठीक है सर इज नाउ कनेक्टेड
Sir, you're connected?
ही कुड हियर
Sir?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Sir, please proceed.
But at this rate, okay.
Sir,
Okay.
कोई बात नहीं.
We're running out of time. Next, please. Hello.
Sir, I switched the slide.
Dr. Rinku, you need to share again.
Share it again?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, share again. Your screen is not shared.
Okay. Just a second. Just give me a moment. नीचे से नीचे से भी कर रहे हैं स्क्रीन ये स्क्रीन शेयर कहाँ से होगा यार
नीचे नीचे सबसे नीचे होगा शेयर स्क्रीन.
Male to male surgery. Yeah, am I audible now?
Yes, you are, sir.
Okay. So I just very briefly told you about male to female surgery. I want to tell you a few slides about female to male surgery. This is complicated, is generally staged. We do not do this in one sitting because otherwise it becomes very long. So we generally do it in 2 stages, that is top surgery and bottom surgery. Top surgery means subcutaneous mastectomy. Now, subcutaneous mastectomy in itself is a very difficult procedure to do. and that takes time. With or without hysterectomy, we generally do not like to have hysterectomy done along with the subcutaneous mastectomy. We can do it later. And the bottom surgery consists of the vaginectomy, that means removing the vagina, partial urethroplasty, that means no, please don't do this, please. Do not do this, don't change slides.
So can you see now?
Yeah, but don't change unless I ask you to.
Okay, sorry, sir, sorry.
Okay, then the formation of the urethra, and with or without hysterectomy, oophorectomy, which is where Rinku and Swati come in, and then phalloplasty, that means creating of the phallus. In the third stage, which is done a year later, that is when the reconstructed organ has got neurological innervation, sensations have been restored because we microsuture these nerves. It's only then that you put in a penile prosthesis or intercourse. So therefore, really speaking, 3 stages, because it's very time consuming. We tried in one case, we did try to do everything together, the first 2 things together, and it took took about 24 hours. So then not to be recommended. This takes a long time. The top surgery itself takes about 2 or 3 hours. The bottom surgery, as I shall tell you, it easily takes about 8 to 9 hours. So this is long surgery. Next, please.
Sir, I changed.
Now look at this individual. This individual was a female with the hormones. You can see the body hair has appeared. The breasts are small. And when these breasts are small, it's very easy for me. Can I have the next slide? So this is the way we do it. And the entire breast is removed through a tiny segment of the skin. The rest is de-epithelialized. Next. And you see, this is the nipple. Now, the male areola is just about 1.5 centimeters in diameter. So it has to be reshaped. It has to retain its pigmentation. It has to retain its blood supply. And it should not leave a scar. That is the ideal way to do a subcutaneous mastectomy. So this person is not going to have a scar at all when all this heals. But next. Very unfortunately, I have to deal with much larger breasts. Now, when breasts are like this obviously cannot be removed through that small incision. And therefore, this procedure that I'm doing in the right slide is called a bipedical subcutaneous mastectomy. So the nipple and areola have to have their blood supply, and to have the areola, the blood supply, the dermis and the subcutaneous fat has to be preserved, and this will go up and this will come. So therefore, this is a more complicated way, and individuals who come to us with a very large breast, which they tie up to hide, that skin loses its turgor and elasticity, and this is a difficult operation to do. Next. Next, please.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so then we come to the important part, that is phalloplasty, that is creating a penis in a individual who is biologically female. So the attributes of a neophallus are that it must be aesthetically looking nice. It must have its sensation. So there's no point having an insensate organ. The person should be able to stand and void upright, should be capable of intercourse, and the scrotum should be normal looking. Unfortunately, this, as I said, is the ideal, new friends. In practice, this does not happen because we always fall short of the ideal. And this is something that I always tell the patient. If you want an absolutely normal penis and scrotum, you have to go to God, because as a surgeon, I can't do it. So whatever I do has to be a compromise between what you want and what a surgeon can do. Can you convert the clitoris into a penis, which is called metaoidoplasty? It is possible, but in my experience, the clitoris rarely enlarges long enough to be of use as a penis. So you have a 30-year-old man with the penis of a 2-year-old child, which is not good. So what are the various ways? You can do abdominal flaps to form a penis, perforator-based flaps, which I shall show you, or a full thickness free flap transfer. which is considered ideal. Next.
We have to be a little quick now, I think. Sorry, sir.
No, then I'll end up. I mean,
ठीक है, sir.
we can go to the last slide and
Okay.
finish off. I don't think you can run through these quickly, otherwise you can omit. So this is how we take it from the forearm. This is a free flap transfer. Next. So the flap based on the radial artery and the cutaneous nerves is taken out. One forms the urethra and the glans, and the other shaft the penis. Next. Hurry up. Yeah, and that is go back. That is the penis that is formed. Go back to the previous one, the one that is showed. Yeah, this is the penis. This is formed on the forearm. So you can see the vessels coming in. You can see the vascularity, and this is the penis that is formed. Next, please. And then you connect the blood vessels to the next. See, that is the great saphenous way. Anyway, that is the final result that you have. This is immediate post-op, and this is after everything has healed. Next, please. Next. So this person is able to void. All right. He's got a penis that looks like normal. But what cannot be hidden is this huge ghastly scar on the forearm, a huge scar on the thigh. So therefore, in our country, which is a hot country, people do not prefer this technique. So the penis looks okay, but what happens is that this you cannot wear a half-sleeve shirt or a pair of shorts, and therefore people generally do not like this technique. So is there any other way? Next, please. So the aim is not to leave a scar. Next. So this is got pubic pedicle flap phalloplasty. Or actually, we could go to the next. So Rinku or Swati have removed the uterus and the ovaries, and then this is a large gap left behind for which I do an abdominoplasty. Next, please. Hurry up. Next. Yeah, and that is a phallus being formed. Next, so the scar is now look at this. The scar is all under the underwear. It is not seen. Next. No. Go back to the slide I was showing you. No. You are going back. Please go forward. Forward. No. Next, please. Yeah. So this. So this is the individual. You can see the scar is not visible when he puts on his clothes. The umbilicus, the lower scar, actually the umbilicus has been shifted up, and that is the good size phallus. So this is the pedicle pubic phalloplasty. Next, please. So I think I must end here. Yes, there is a greater awareness of GID now. What is important is a full-fledged team. It is not possible for one individual to do everything. For example, I know nothing of psychiatry, and I do not like to remove a uterus when there are specialists available. Surgical techniques are challenging, and follow-up is essential. Next, please. Next. Yeah, I think I've ended. Thank you. I have taken too much time.
Thank you so much, sir. I think we'll move on. Thank you, sir. We'll get back to you with the questions. So we quickly move on to Dr. Preeti. Dr. Preeti is here. Dr. Preeti?
Yes, I'm here.
Please start screen sharing.
Yeah, just give me a minute to start screen sharing.
So endometriosis, another group of patients who are marginalized and ostracized because of pain, infertility, and depression, I think. So over to Dr. Preeti.
Well, after that mesmerizing talk by sir, I think the mood is set for something different. However, I'll just proceed with talking about endometriosis. Yes, whenever we see such a patient in OPD, sometimes it's a diagnostic enigma to all of us. Sometimes it's a therapeutic dilemma. When you take the patient to OT, at times you are encountering a surgical nightmare. Post-surgery, you're always thinking, have you done something wrong in large endometriomas and deep infiltrating endometriosis? You think of, is there litigation looming large somewhere? Have I done a fertility disaster? Is her marriage in danger? Will I be able to make her smile? There is this uncalled for recurring deposit from the uterine bank, which is going to come back anytime. And why? There are no answers to that, unfortunately. So with this in the back of mind, I present to you everlasting challenges of endometriosis, particularly with a view from the infertility point of view. Now, as we already know, and I don't think there is need to go into that detail, that endometriosis is fraught with so many complications, starting from the adolescent age to the reproductive age and goes on much beyond that. Patients who are trying to conceive often have reduced response to ovarian inductions. If they've undergone some kind of surgery or even otherwise, they have reduced ovarian reserve. When they take the resort of artificial reproductive techniques, they have reduced fertilization and implantation rates. Sometimes the ovaries are absolutely inaccessible. There is always a chance of recurrence, and post IVF also there are chances of abscess formation. Now here I would like to focus on this particular aspect. Usually one ovary is inaccessible, but it can sometimes be both ovaries inaccessible. The commonest pelvic pathology that is associated with this condition is endometriosis, but it could be also subsequent to pelvic inflammatory disease, fibroid uterus surgeries, any other pelvic surgeries, and also congenital Müllerian anomalies. In literature, the incidence is reported to be 0.4 to 1.6%. And the intervening structure between the vagina and the ovary may be fat, fibrosis, omentum, bowel, anything. Now, this is just an ultrasound picture to show you how the ovary here is adherent, plastered to the posterior surface of the uterus. Now, this is an unoperated case. The second case here, can you all see my slide? The second case here is a patient who has not had any surgery ever. The difference between these two cases is, this is a known case of endometrioma, goes on to undergo surgery. She also has tubal factors involved, whereas here there is no such etiology. Well, it could be PID or it could be some unknown etiology because we never subjugated her to any kind of laparoscopy. But this is the kind of picture we get. Of course, it's very important to assess the ovaries, the accessibility of the ovaries whenever we are trying to start an IVF cycle. That's because that is the inherent way to approach the ovaries is from the vagina, apart from the ovarian reserve tests, etc. We also do the accessibility test by doing a simple transvaginal scan. Where you find inaccessible ovaries, as I just demonstrated, the relationship between the uterus and adnexa is very important to define. Either it could be by a simple TVS, but at times we also need a CT or an MRI or an advanced imaging technology to understand the relationship. Why this is important, I will just explain. Now, laparoscopy findings also help to an extent to understand what lies between the uterus adnexa and the pelvic walls, and also sometimes to free the ovaries and make them accessible. This is one such video. You can see the patient has had a previous surgery. The ovaries are lying absolutely anterior to the uterus. This is on the left side of the patient. The tube apparently looks normal. There is a curtain which is being formed by bowel, omentum right onto the uterus. And when we look on the opposite side, it's the similar situation. How can we ever do? The tubes, of course, on testing came to be blocked, and the approach is from the pouch of Douglas, which ultimately we have dissected away and made these ovaries prolapse into the POD so as to be able to do an IVF on her. In certain cases, it is a boon to have ultrasound during surgery, an intraoperative ultrasound, which has proved very beneficial in cases like fibroid uterus to remove, intramural myomas, which are otherwise not visible. But I have been using to assess how much of this ovary that we have to dissect, sometimes in plastered endometriotic cyst ovary, how much we really need to, bite it out, how much we need to shave off that area, whether or not it is accessible from below. And that really is a challenge to make a decision, a challenging decision to make. So coming to the conventional methods of oocyte retrieval, the original techniques that were described were laparoscopic, followed by an ultrasound-guided transabdominal, transvesical, transurethral, all these are also reported. However, they fell soon into disrepute when transvaginal ultrasound-guided egg retrieval gained popularity around the 80s. Of course, it was simple to do, easy. A very good view was obtained because of the large transducer megahertz, and then still some ovaries which were found adherent, displaced, or anatomically distorted, it was not possible to do a conventional pickup for them. So other options came up, like pushing the ovary down with abdominal pressure, or applying a tenaculum for cervical traction, or doing a transabdominal, transperitoneal oocyte retrieval, or a transvaginal, transmyometrial oocyte retrieval. So presenting the data that I have here of 12 patients who had inaccessible ovaries. This is the first case which I've shown you the video for. And most of these cases were endometriosis. And we have done transmyometrial pickup in 5 such patients. This is the clinical data that is available for these patients. Many have undergone lap cystectomies, as you can see. Some have associated male and tubal factors as well. Some have absolutely low AMH and high FSH values. But the gist of it is that in some, of course, we had to do interventions like repeat surgery for a very large endometrioma or for pain purposes. And transmyometrial pickup was done, which gave us good results in terms of the oocytes obtained or fertilized. ICSI was done as per indication. In this, there was a male factor. And in this other patient, the first cycle yielded very poor number of eggs. So she underwent a second cycle in which we were able to give her 2 blasts and a transfer as well. The second time, we could avoid a transmyometrial pickup, only applying a tenaculum helped. Another patient who I did a transmyometrial pickup was, of course, not with endometriosis, but with a bicornuate uterus. As I've already mentioned, these are some of the patients who also have absolutely inaccessible adnexa. Now, these were all young patients. And like I said, I have described mostly for endometriosis. So it just explains the dilemma that we sometimes encounter when we take them up for the ultimate fertility treatment, that is IVF. Because in endometriosis, long agonist protocol helps. So mostly these patients, whoever underwent surgery also, they were subsequent cycle itself, they were taken up for IVF and they underwent transfers. Mostly I have been avoiding doing a fresh transfer where I do a transmyometrial pickup, although it is not reported in literature. Basically, it stimulates uterine contractions, and so there is a chance of a negative result. We got 2 pregnancies which are ongoing in these 5 patients that I have told you the details about. I think we will not go into the details because of lack of time about the procedure involved. Routine preparation, antibiotics are definitely must. Counseling of the patient is done prior, that there may be a requirement to do a transmyometrial pickup, which will entail some chance of infection, hemorrhage, etc. Although we do check the entry point with Doppler, we avoid the endometrium, avoid multiple entry points, ensure vaginal and peritoneal hemostasis. You can just ask the anesthetist to continue anesthesia and watch the POD for any kind of filling that you may notice from the ovaries. At times, bimanual compression and IV tranexamic acid can stop it there and then. Of course, patient needs strict vital monitoring, and the warning signs are also assessed before discharge and after discharge. And sometimes the patients may be recalled to have a relook ultrasound after 2 days. So the passage, the same photograph that I showed earlier, the passage of the needle would be in this direction. This is an unstimulated ovary. Most of the times, like I said, we can avoid this transmyometrial pickup because when with gonadotropin stimulation, the ovarian size enlarges, then ovaries can either become very heavy and prolapse into the POD, especially when it is flimsy adhesions due to PID, etc., but not so in endometriosis. So why we chose this transmyometrial pickup is because specific complications I came across in the laparoscopic and the transabdominal procedures. The laparoscopic yields very less number of oocytes, and in the transabdominal, there is a high risk of bowel injury. You also need a second operator. This is the most convenient, safe, and efficacious, though very little reported in literature. And yet, I have presented my experience to you. I will probably present the OBS part once I collect a few more cases. There are definitely potential complications, but thankfully, so far, we have not come across. That is possible because of the very short collection of cases. There is definite a reason to worry for hemorrhage, infection, injury to surrounding structures, triggering of these uterine contractions leading to a negative result, postoperative extra pain, maybe prolonged hospitalization. And the limitations, of course, are that one should have a fair knowledge of the anatomy there, understand the imaging, be wary for complications. Only it is suitable when the ovary is directly adherent to the wall of the uterus. And probably we should learn not to cancel transfers and attempt some transfers and understand how it affects the results. And some people have been reporting Dopplers after 4 hours of the procedure, 6 hours, 12 hours like this, to understand the blood loss if there is any. But we have not done that. We have done just strict clinical monitoring. So to conclude, endometriosis can adversely affect fecundity by many, many mechanisms. And presence of endometrioma itself seems to damage fertility outcome, not just that we subject them to a lot of surgery, so it impairs the ovarian reserve further. With adherent and inaccessible ovaries, transmyometrial pickup is a feasible option. There is no significant difference in the oocyte recovery rates, implantation, or pregnancy rates. Like we got out of the transfers that we have done, 3 transfers, 2 became pregnant. The other 2 have not yet opted for transfer because one patient has to travel and the other one has undergone a lap cholecystectomy. So we proposed to the dog that surgery should not be the first thing to do in an endometriosis patient. And if it is at all required for the specific indications, one should keep in mind not only to restore the tubal-ovarian relationship, but also free the POD and avoid the raw areas in that area so that we keep need for future IVF cycle in mind. So basically in modern endometriosis management, patients need to be at the center of therapeutic decisions. Thank you. I hope you all get patients with happy ovaries. Dr. Rinku?
Yes,
Please take over. Thank you.
Please.
तो पता क्या हो गया?
I have already stopped sharing, so you.
Can you hear us?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, please. So good evening, everyone. Due to paucity of time, I will have to rush through our presentation and share our experience about meconium babies. So let me share our experience as a team on behalf of our team. So meconium has been an enigma since ages, and this we can say way back when Aristotle coined this term, and in fact, he was the one who noted the relationship between meconium in amniotic fluid and sleepy fetal state in utero. So the thought comes to our mind, is meconium always dangerous? And I would like to tell you that the perceived danger of mass is more than what it is in reality, and it in fact influences our obstetric decisions to a large extent. And if I talk about the incidence of meconium stain lichens, it has remained stagnant over the last century at just 10 to 15%. And amongst that, mass has been only 2 to 4%, and it has seemed to be drastically reduced over the last 30 years. But we have to keep few things in mind. We have to take the entire clinical scenario, such as the type of meconium we face, and we also should pay attention to anybody who comes to us with decreased fetal movements, any associated obstetric or medical risk factors, presence of oligohydramnios, and of course, any CTG abnormality. So what is this physiology of meconium? So it actually just means, the evidence says it is just fetal maturation. So when the digestive system of baby is mature, the system works to push out the meconium. So we see that only 10 to 15% of term babies have meconium, and it increases to 30 to 40% post-term babies. Another theory is when there is vagal mediated increased GI peristalsis, which we see during the mechanism of labor, and this is due to cord or head compression. And lastly, it happens in some cases of fetal hypoxia due to the relaxation of anal sphincter. The types is non-significant, significant, non-significant is just a liquid which is green tinged and there is no particulate matter in it. And significant is much more darker green and thicker and lumpy. So what is it? Meconium is just an environmental hazard for fetus, and it does not mean that it is a marker for any pre-existing compromise. So with this background in mind, we conducted a study in our institute, and for over the last 5 years, it was a retrospective study, and we studied mothers with singleton cephalic more than 36 weeks. So our total deliveries were close to 3,700 plus, and meconium babies were 400. That comes to 11% of incidence. And we also studied whether these mothers were in early labor or active labor, and we can see that as much as 53% had meconium right from when they were in latent labor. And this we correlated that did it affect the route of delivery. So we see that we had normal deliveries in 60% of the cases and instrumental in 14%, so making a total of 75%. That means 3/4 of our meconium stained mothers delivered vaginally and 26% were cesarean. And this is another comparison to see whether there was any difference in the cesarean rates in non-MSL and MSL groups. And we see in non-MSL, it was 20%, and with MSL, it was 26%. So not much of difference. Yes, our instrumental rates almost double up from 8% to 14%. So with this background in mind, I would like to share it with Dr. Swati, the further experience.
Good evening, everyone. So as you can see, our cesarean section rates in the meconium group were not very different from that in the non-meconium group. And how could we achieve it? That was through the evidence-based protocols that we try and follow in our institute. When a woman comes with meconium stained liquor, we try to distinguish between the non-significant and the significant meconium. In the women with significant meconium, a thorough screening is done to rule out any associated risk factors for intrauterine hypoxia or FGR, and the patient is put on a continuous CTG. If it's a reassuring CTG, then she's given 1:1 care throughout, keeping an eye on the watch for progress of labor. And we try and avoid prolonged second stage in such women, and we may use episiotomy or instrumental delivery if the need arises. A neonatologist or a pediatrician who is thorough with resuscitation is always present at the time of delivery, and we try and do an ABG-VBG in all cases, so for the medico-legal implications. If during the course of labor the woman has suspicious CTG, then as per the usual protocol, intrauterine resuscitative measures are taken. And if the CTG improves, then we continue with further trial. And however, if there is persistent non-reassuring CTG, we do resort to cesarean section. And in women who come with significant meconium with a CTG which is abnormal anytime in labor or before the onset of labor, we would go in for a cesarean section. I would not go into the non-significant meconium because that is more or less the way we manage our other women. So the discussion would be incomplete if I did not talk about the perinatal outcomes. We had the incidence of meconium aspiration syndrome was in 3.7% of our babies. That is 15 babies out of the 400 mothers who were there with meconium stained liquor had MAS. And only 6, that is less than 50% of babies were born with an APGAR score of less than 7 at 1 minute. And there was only one neonatal mortality. That was a baby who was born to a low-risk mother with a normal CTG. At birth, the baby cried, but soon thereafter, it had severe respiratory distress, which did not respond to the usual intubation, ventilation. We did offer autopsy. However, we do not really know if there was any underlying other cause that was responsible for the neonatal mortality. Amongst the babies who went to the nursery and stayed there for more than 72 hours, they were 31 in number. A big chunk was due to meconium aspiration syndrome, that was 48%. However, TTNB also contributed to 16%, and early onset sepsis was also the cause for prolonged stay. We understand that MAS continues to be an unresolved mystery, and I would just like to share our experience with a low-risk mother whom we had, who gave us a difficult time a few years back. This patient, Mrs. S, came to labor room at 7 a.m. in the morning, a primary 29-year-old at 39 weeks with history of backache for the last 4 hours. Her CTG at admission looked like this. And this did raise concerns. However, we thought it is just the first 20-25 minutes. Let us observe it for a while. We were concerned about the reduced beat-to-beat variability, loss of cyclicity, and the subsequent CTG trace seemed to be getting worse with late accelerations. Therefore, with late decelerations. Therefore, we decided to do a per vaginum examination and ARM at one finger, which showed thick meconium. And there was thereafter, just after the ARM, the patient had a prolonged deceleration and she was quickly rushed in for cesarean. The baby was born with an ABGAR of 688 and it had fetal, the cord blood ABG did show acidosis. The baby's respiratory distress worsened over the next 4 to 5 hours, requiring intubation and ventilatory support. The baby was weaned off the ventilator at day 6 and was discharged in a healthy condition on day 12. So just to sum it up, there are 3 distinct mechanisms for meconium stain liquor. It could be the physiological maturation event, or a response to acute hypoxic event, or it could be an indication of underlying chronic intrauterine hypoxia. Per se, meconium is not a sign of fetal distress, and we need a holistic approach to managing such patients, wherein we should be able to screen and pick up women who are at increased risk for having MAS. In significant meconium, the management involves continuous CTG and urgent CS when there is non-reassuring CTG. Measures like labor induction at less than 41 weeks, avoiding ARM so as to prevent reducing the volume of liquor and to maintain the dilution of the meconium, and judicious use of oxytocin are some other ways to reduce the fetal harm. It is true that MAS is a challenging condition. However, in our study, the incidence was low, and the intention of sharing the study was to emphasize that when we follow the right processes, mostly we have good outcomes. And in our study, most poor outcomes were in MSL associated with chronic antepartum fetal injury, which are usually not altered by perinatal management, and they are associated with high CS and instrumental delivery rates. Thank you. I will end my discussion.
We'll hand over to Dr.
I'll hand over to Dr. Renu for any questions.
Yeah, I know time is a big problem today. Dr. Renu, please.
Thank you, Dr. Rinku. It was a very nice presentation and a very nicely held monthly meet with such a varied presentation of so many varied subjects were also discussed. And now I would like, from the judges, I would like to invite Dr. Sudha Prasad. Dr. Sudha Prasad, in case Dr. Sudha Prasad has any questions to ask from the presenters. Can I have?
Maybe Dr. Sudha Prasad is left because she had another webinar at 5:30.
Yes, she did tell us. Fine. Then can I have Dr. Sangeeta Gupta?
Good evening, everybody. And first of all, I thank the AOGD to give me this opportunity. And I must congratulate the team of Sitaram Bhartiya for an excellent presentation of topics. One like cesarean audit, which is really need of the hour. And on other hand, sensitizing everybody to the gender dysphoria, which had been unheard of before this. And also the third presentation by Dr. Preeti Dhamija on endometriosis and this transmyometrial ovum pickup. So they were excellent presentations. I have a few questions from the third presentation to Dr. Swati. So my first question is, otherwise, what is your cesarean section rate? Just not in the fetal distress category, the total cesarean section rate at your institution.
So ma'am, that was the slide where we compared. It's almost 20%. That was an overall for the last 5 years, and this includes all the Robson criteria. This is not according to the different Robson criteria. For the Robson 1 and 2, it is as low as 12 to 13%.
So ma'am, if we talk about the last 5 years, because our monthly deliveries are low, so the overall rate is 20%. Dr. Swati showed us on the slide, but the nulliparous CS group we usually calculate separately. So over the last 5 years, the rate is around 15%, ma'am.
That's excellent. Now, second, did you do the cord blood of all these deliveries which were diagnosed with MSL?
No, ma'am. It may not, in the initial years, since I have collected the data from 2016, in the initial years, we did not have the facility available so rampant. But now, and also because of our experience that we have gathered, we understand that it's imperative that we take the cord blood ABG. And it took us some time to get sensitized to when we get stressed with a distressed baby, we tend to forget about the cord altogether. We rush with the baby.
And we usually miss out.
So this was a training that we had to do again and again to remember and do a double clamping of the cord so that even at a later time, maybe a few minutes later, once we have settled the baby, we take the sample.
Okay. Any fetal scalp blood sampling? You have any experience with it? No. Okay. And my last question is that you showed that a significant number of babies were in the latent phase.
Yes.
So what was the, how many of them translated to vaginal delivery?
I so ma'am, it was close to 80% of them delivered vaginally.
Okay.
So
that's,
almost 50%
then I must congratulate the team. This is really an achievement. And that is all from my side. And of course, Dr. Kotwal, I must thank him. He has so simply brought forth a topic which will soon, I think, take the gynecologists by fire, because most of us are soon going to encounter these kind of situations in our clinical practice. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Dr. Kotwal is here if anybody has any questions for him.
I do not know if Dr. Rajurkar is there because he was also assigned one of the judges.
He's there, I can see him.
Okay, then you just tell him to, he also can log in and he can also.
I
was not able to join. I could not, I just able to hear just few minutes before about the I had to go somewhere urgently. So about the meconium aspiration, I think it's a age-old problem of whether it is a gynecological field or a neonatology field.
Yes.
And we have been fighting with each other.
Yes.
And so actually, I always suggested all the colleges should have the training period on their senior 1 month in a neonatology unit, and all the neonatologists should have a posting in the gynae for 1 month, because this problem kiski galti hai, and the things have changed many times in many years. When I was a PG, actually I did my DCH and followed by MD gynae. Therefore, I am saying this. And hospital, Anderson regime, hai na? So,
I think his connection is not there. Dr. Rajurkar, your connection is very weak.
Dr. Renu, I would like to say something more.
Yes, yeah, please do.
Yeah, one that this time the Narchi Bulletin also carries an article on gender dysphoria. So I would request everybody to go through that also, because there are some medical legal aspects and some policies which the government of India is going to make, and that's very important. And second, I take this opportunity to invite everybody to the NACHI annual conference, which is scheduled on 27th, 28th, and 29th of August. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Dr. Achla, do you see Dr. Shaktiban Khanna there? In
No, Dr. Khanna said she has got stuck somewhere, but I can see a lot of luminaries. If anybody wants to ask, I can see Dr. Sunita Mittal, I can see Dr. Usha Gupta, I can see Dr. Chitra Raghunandan, I can see Dr. Sudha Salan, and Dr. Bhargav, of course, is there. So,
one
if
question,
any one of them want to ask something, you know.
Yeah, definitely. You're welcome. That will make it more interactive. Though it is now time, we have crossed that time, but it doesn't matter. We are sitting at home. Till then, can we have one question is there from the audience?
Renu, can I ask one question?
Yeah, please do, please do.
You see, whenever the meconium appears at the time of ARM or the patient comes to the emergency with meconium stain like immediately the concerns of the family, the members who are, when you tell them that there is a fetal distress, then it is very difficult to make them understand what is the importance of meconium and how then they all want to rush to cesarean section once you tell them there is a fetal distress. How have you reacted to that, and how have you managed those panic in the relatives once the fetal distress is explained to the relatives?
So, ma'am,
Very important
what we
question.
do in our institute, can I answer that question for you? So, if you look at the RCOG patient information guide, it clearly says, that meconium could be a variant, isn't it? It does not necessarily mean that the baby is compromised. But at the same time, if you're able to do a proper continuous CTG, you can be most of the time safe, because this is a clear-cut guideline. We are following a guideline. We're not just going by what we want. But at the same time, I understand that this kind of a management, can be very difficult in a government hospital where you don't have a CTG. You can't do a 1:1 care. So we are fortunate in being able to do this. And since we are working in these conditions, I think in the private setup, we should be able to explain to the patient. And I think antenatally also we explain. In the workshops, we can do that. It is not that MSL means a cesarean section and a fetal distress. In fact, this is one of the main key issues that came up in our journey of reducing cesarean, apart from CS on demand and non-progressive labor. But of course, a continuous CTG is a must. You will not be medico-legally safe if you're not doing that.
Yes, exactly. In a crowded hospital with a number of patients lying, continuous CTG monitoring may not be feasible. And what would be your advice to those situations when when CTG monitoring is not available? Intermittent auscultation.
Yes. So one thing is that, ma'am, I think the most important problem with not doing a CTG is missing out on chronic hypoxia. So I think the history of reduced fetal movement should be definitely taken. The type of meconium should always be kept in mind, and of course the risk profile of the patient. If anything anybody wants to add, you can. But despite that, once you think it is an insignificant meconium, I still feel that at least an intermittent CTG should be done.
Or our admission CTG will tell us a lot. Who are the patients whom we don't need to be alarmed about? Plus, I wanted to add, ma'am, that there are some studies to say that meconium aspiration does not only happen in utero. We do not know at what time it happens. It happens with the first breath, which is irrespective of the mode of delivery, whether it is the vaginal route or the cesarean section.
Yeah.
So the first breath is the cause. Yeah, it is also true that intrauterine hypoxia causes gasping movement for the babies, and then they aspirate in utero. But for that, we are monitoring. However, we cannot reduce the chances of aspiration that may happen with the first breath. That is something that we have to emphasize. So whenever we have meconium, we counsel our mothers and partner that this problem is there. Its outcome is not going to differ very much by the mode of delivery. And we are continuously being vigilant. And in fact, there are some studies which say that the pathophysiology of severe MAS is different from that of mild and moderate MAS. Mild and moderate MAS is related to the distress of labor. However, they say severe MAS has some different pathophysiology, which is not very well understood.
How soon the patient should deliver once meconium has been detected? Maybe moderate meconium or thick meconium. CTG monitoring may be there or may not be there. But what should be the optimum duration, time interval between that detection and the delivery, which can give a good result?
I don't think there is, ma'am, any such clear-cut yardstick. But at the same time, we have to take all the parameters in question. So if it is a suspicious CTG, abnormal CTG, we have to act fast. If it is a good reassuring CTG, the mother has been having good fetal movements till now, I think we can wait and we can see what is happening.
Good substitute
I
to
just have to,
is a post-contraction auscultation, ma'am, as we have learned from you only in labor room.
Yes.
That is
After
very
the
important.
contraction, if there is a persistent
Deceleration.
heart rate
Even
below
person can pick up.
120, then one has to be wary about it. And if there is a persistent fall in FHS following contractions, then that is an indication of doing a
You're
cesarean
doing
section
a Doppler.
in the absence of CTG monitoring.
Sure.
Yeah, but Dr. Chitra, the issue again boils down to the, poor ratio patient,
Yes.
doctor-patient ratio here, where you don't have a CTG, you don't have a good, doctor-patient ratio to do that kind of intensive monitoring. In these patients, if we resort to a post-contraction fetal heart, then probably one auscultation minimum in 15 minutes after each contraction. I think the challenges are somehow linked with each other.
Yes.
And a second statement which I wanted to make was that you made a statement in the last slide that chronic hypoxia, if there, we can leave the patient for vaginal because peripartum events are unlikely to affect. I think I beg to disagree here.
No, we didn't say that we can leave, ma'am. We said that we are we have to face the music because it is we do the needful.
Yeah,
yet-
I think they will need more intensive monitoring, and they are the patients who are more likely to have intrapartum, actual distress, true distress, because they are already compromised, and the brunt of contractions will only add further to it. So,
oh, can I just make a comment?
yeah, sure, ma'am.
You have to be quicker to deliver the baby.
Can I?
Yes,
just-
of course. Dr. Anjana, please.
Yeah. So one thing, I think meconium staining should not be considered a synonymous of fetal distress. One thing. That's very for sure. Secondly, there are two categories of patients, low risk and high risk. They are totally different. We cannot, treat both of them together as one. So if we are dealing with it, because I also am very keen on vaginal deliveries, and it will be tough for me to do a cesarean. So what I'm saying, but if I'm dealing with a high risk patient, my attitude is different than when I'm dealing with a low risk population. Thank you. And CT, and the other thing is, working in a government hospital where, patient to doctor ratio is really, lots of patients under one doctor. So that's difficult for them. Thank you.
We have only one question from the audience. That is, what are the resuscitative measures in case of the meconium, and any experience with the amnion infusion? Can you just briefly touch it before we proceed for the quiz session?
So in the protocol slide where I said intrauterine resuscitative measures, they are the standard resuscitative measures we do for any patient who has a non-reassuring CTG, which means we try and change position. As it is, we try and maintain a non-supine position for most of our patient, left lateral or on all fours, or these different positions, we try to keep them during labor. And sometimes IV fluids to improve the hydrations. These are the measures that we try, and maybe a scalp stimulation by doing an internal examination would put us at ease if we have acceleration following scalp stimulation on the CTG. So these are the things we like to do once we are having a non-reassuring CTG. They are same as the as a non-MSL patient. However, yes, we don't do amnion infusion because according to the latest guideline, there is no role of such obstetric strategies in a center where there is good intrapartum care and neonatal care. It is maybe useful for some centers which don't have such setups, but in a center like ours where we have good perinatal care and intrapartum care, there's no role of amnion infusion.
Amnion infusion has not been found to change the perinatal outcome.
Yes.
Very nice.
And what about maternal oxygenation? Are you using that?
That's
No,
also
there is no role. There is no role of maternal oxygenation.
Unless
In
the
fact, it
mother
does
is-
more harm than good. That's the
I think Dr. Sunesh wants to say something. Dr.
Yes.
Sunesh,
That will be so good. Yeah.
Dr. Sunesh,
Dr.
last
Sunesh.
word from you. No more questions after that.
Thank
Yes,
you.
Dr. Sunesh, please.
For Dr. Kotwal, I'm surprised. I thought there would be some.
So I have a
And
comment I can make later.
I think it is long-term outcome, maybe at the end of 2 years, which tells whether our policy of managing meconium stain pregnancies is right. often we have seen where we manage well, CTG was done in labor, delivered vaginally, but after 1 year or 2 years, we face the mother and the baby that with a neurological problem. So one cannot have a standard approach to all meconium cases.
Of course.
And cord blood pH has been used in number of studies, but it hasn't correlated with the neurological outcome. It can just tell you whether it is a chronic hypoxia or just a recent onset meconium. So while facing a meconium stain, like one has to keep mind open, eyes open, and should not be very strict with one line of managing these patients.
Of course.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sunesh, for joining and for such a nice remark. Thank you very much. And thank you, Dr. Rinku, also, and your team. And I must thank Dr. Kotwal also, because it was a very nice topic that he has discussed. Recently, we also came across a patient, and that was a girl. She wanted to become a boy. And when I asked her, she was one sister of 4 brothers. So I just wanted to ask where the problem lies. And she said, Manika, is it because of your brothers that you are being brought up like a boy? She said, no. I am loved. My parents are also very happy that I am girl, but still I feel my soul is trapped in this body. So she was counseled and counseled and counseled, and ultimately we had to do hysterectomy. The problem with us was laparoscopic hysterectomy. We were a bit uncertain. I do not know what Dr. Kotwal has to say about that, in case he's still around and he's
Sir, are you there?
He also has only mentioned total abdominal hysterectomy.
So, sir, ma'am, that is just one of the surgeries, okay, gender reassignment.
Because, yeah, gender change, whatever he has shown was abdominal hysterectomy, but because the incision that he had shown. So that's what I just wanted to discuss. Anyway, it was just a comment from outside.
Ma'am, it could be laparoscopic. Sorry, it could be laparoscopic, but the incision is.
Yes.
I think very nice cases. They really, opened our minds to things which were not there, meconium and the gender euphoria. But I think the people are now waiting for the quiz.
Yes, yeah.
So I think we should have the quiz. And thank you, Rinku.
Sure.
And thank you, Preeti, and
thank you, ma'am. Thank you, everybody.
And Nikita for and of course Dr. Kotwal.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So over to the quiz now.
Thank you, ma'am. Rekha?
Yeah, thank you, Rinku, and thank you, Dr. Achla. So now, after this very informative and interactive session, we go on to another interesting session of this clinical meeting, which is the quiz. And you all can see in the chat box, there is a link provided. As usual, the quiz will be on Kahoot platform. You have a link in the chat box. So you can just go and click on the link. Shivam, can you please start the quiz now? Yes, so after you press on the link, you'll be asked about the game pin, and the pin is 16000023. I'll again repeat the pin 16000023. So in the nickname, you all please write your phone numbers so that we can contact you. The people who win the quiz, they'll be asked to raise their hands, and will be invited. They will be asked to introduce themselves. So the first 3 winners would be asked to switch on their videos, and they can interact with the team here. So we'll just wait for a few more entries to be there before we start the quiz. I'll again repeat the pin of the quiz. It is 16000023.
Somebody has logged in as
160023.
Rekha ma'am, somebody has logged in as number 1.
I think they've changed. She has changed. So please enter your phone number in the nickname. If there is any difficulty, you can post it in the chat box. The link is there. So just press on the link and enter the game pin. I can see only 7 participants. Is it that we have taken too long and people have logged out?
Yeah, I guess so, ma'am, because
Yeah.
it was quite a long meeting. So
I know.
I guess, ma'am, we can start. Let's see.
Yeah, I think we started. So as you all know, this quiz is based on this month's bulletin, which was on revisiting family welfare services. So we go on to the questions. There'll be 5 questions, and these are multiple choice questions or true or false. So you just have to tick on the right choice. So Monica, we'll have to lock then before we go on to the quiz. So shall we lock?
I will just once more announce if there we can still see almost 40 participants in the meeting. If somebody wants to log in, please do now, else we are locking the participants for the quiz.
One is logged out.
No, ma'am. One came in. No.
It is
went
showing
away.
as 7 now.
Yeah,
From
it is 7
it has
again.
gone down to
Okay,
7.
ma'am, I guess let's start.
Okay, so I think we can lock now, Shivam. Yeah, and we go on to the questions. So these are very interesting questions, you know, based on our bulletin. Yes, the first question is to ensure that woman is not pregnant. All are correct except first choice is she is within 7 days of her normal menses. Second is she is non-lactating within 6 weeks postpartum. Third is nearly fully breastfeeding, amenorrheic, and less than 6 months postpartum. And fourth choice is she is correctly and consistently using a reliable method of contraception. So you have to choose which of these is not correct. So to ensure that the woman is not pregnant, all are correct except.
Only
10
5
seconds
have
left.
answered. 6.
No negative marking.
There is no
And your names are not there, so it's
it's only 6 people have answered out of 7.
yes. So as you can clearly see, the correct answer is non-lactating within 6 weeks postpartum. The correct thing is that if a patient is non-lactating, she should be within 4 weeks of her delivery to be reasonably sure that she is not pregnant. So now we go on to the second question. The second question is, if following contraceptive is initiated between 5th to 7th day of cycle, advise additional protection for 7 days. Choice 1 is LNG IUDs. Choice number 2 is progestogen implants, progestogen only injectables, or progestogen only pill. So when will you advise a patient an additional protection for 7 days if you start contraceptive between 5th to 7th day of cycle? So as you can see, they're all progesterone based contraceptives. The only thing different here is the route of administration. Yes, now you can see the correct answer. When you was using progesterone only pills, it should be either used within 5 days of the period, or if you are advising it after 5 days, then you should advise another method of protection for 7 days. And with other progesterone delivery systems, you can initiate them at 7 weeks or 7 days after periods also. So this is the correct answer, that with progesterone only pills, you should start it within 5 days of the periods. So we can go on to the third question now. Okay. Yes, now the third question is, which of the following is correct for vaginal contraceptive rings? First is, we all know they are used for 3 weeks and then there is 1 week ring-free interval. So the first choice is, if left for more than 3 weeks, but less than or equal to 5 weeks, new ring insertion can be done after 1 week of ring-free interval. Second is, tampons should not be used with contraceptive rings. Third is, contraceptive ring should be removed during intercourse. And fourth choice is none of the above. So which of the following is correct for vaginal contraceptive rings? First choice is that if it is used for more than 3 weeks, but less than or equal to 5 weeks, you can have 1 week ring-free interval. And if patient has breakthrough bleeding, tampons should not be used for contraceptive. So the correct answer, you can all see, the tampons can be used. It does not interfere with the contraceptive ring. And the contraceptive ring has to be worn even during intercourse. So the correct answer is that up to 5 weeks, if the patient has used the ring, it will be effective. You can have 1 week of ring-free interval. But after that, the ring-free interval has to be omitted and extra protection has to be used for 7 days. So we go on to the next question now. Yeah, so fourth question is, which of the following statement is not correct for ulipristal acetate? First, it is contraindicated in severe anemia on oral glucocorticoids. Second is, it is approved as emergency contraception by FDA, but not by DGCI. Third is that it has better efficacy than LNG ECs. Fourth is, progesterone only pills can be started for regular contraception along with ulipristal acetate. So you have to actually tick on the statement which is not correct. So this ulipristal acetate, it is contraindicated in patients who have severe asthma and are on oral glucocorticoids. Otherwise, you can use it in asthma also. And it is approved by FDA for emergency contraception, but not by DGCI. It has better efficacy than levonorgestrel emergency contraceptives, but it is progesterone antagonist. So you have to remember that no progesterone containing contraceptive should be given within 7 days of starting. Actually, it is 5 days, to be on safer side, 7 days. So a gap of 5 days is must before you start any contraception which contains progesterone. So this is one very important thing if you want to use ulipristal acetate as emergency contraceptive pill. So the last question of today's quiz is, it's true and false, basically. The statement you have to see. So if you want to do MTP of a woman at 16 weeks gestation, you need approval of 2 registered medical practitioners to sign in Form 1, which is the opinion form. So is it true or false? Yes, the answer is true. Till date, because we do not have rules and regulations laid down for the new MTP Act 2021. So if we want to do second trimester MTP, we should take signatures of 2 registered medical practitioners who are approved for doing MTPs to go ahead with the MTP. So I think we can have the winners, and to announce the winners, I invite Dr. Jyotsna Suri.
Yeah, hello.
Yes.
Can you hear Rekha?
Yeah, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Please.
So first of all, I would like to congratulate Rekha for conducting this quiz so beautifully and for such nice questions. So it is really very nice to see these, questions which are got so much of, you have given them so much information also while discussing. So I think the PGs and the residents who have attended and who have answered are very lucky, but I wish the participation was more. Somehow the participation this time is a little less. So anyway, can we have, Shivam, can we have the names of the winners or the numbers, phone numbers? Yeah, so can you identify yourself with your phone numbers in the chat box, please? All of you, first, second, and third.
And if any of the winners of the poster competition are also there, what are the names? Aditi Chawla and Kanika and Sujata. If they are also there, they can also be made to join in, because
yes. So have they identified? Has anybody identified themselves?
Yes, ma'am. Dr. Priyanka Singh is first. She has written in the chat box.
Okay.
She's a regular candidate.
Yes, now.
A frequent prize winner now.
Yes. So Priyanka, please make her a panelist. Shivam, please upgrade her. What about the second? Yeah, second and third.
Aditi Chawla.
Aditi
Second
Chawla.
is Aditi Chawla.
Yes. Yes, please upgrade Aditi.
Aditi Chawla is second for poster competition as well. Is she second for the quiz also?
No, there is another name, Dr. Rita Malik.
Rita Malik.
So first we'll do the quiz, then we'll call the poster competition winners.
Yes.
Yes. So, and who is the third? Okay, in the meantime, have we upgraded Rita Malik and Priyanka Singh? Yeah. So where is Priyanka? Priyanka, please put your mic on and
Good
your
evening,
camera
ma'am.
on. Yeah, Priyanka. So can you introduce yourself?
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, I'm Dr. Priyanka Singh, and I have done my post-graduation from Maulana Azad Medical College, New Delhi. And currently I'm working in DY Patil Hospital, New Mumbai.
Yeah, so you won the quiz previously also.
Yes, ma'am.
First one, I think.
Yes, ma'am. Last one.
Yes. So congratulations again, Priyanka. We are so happy to see your enthusiasm. And please
you, ma'am.
do remain logged in all the meetings and participate enthusiastically like this always. Okay,
Yes,
so
ma'am.
your number and your email is already there. You will get your certificate and your prize. Okay.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you, Priyanka.
Thank
So, who is our second winner? Rita Malik. Rita?
Yes, good evening.
Yeah, Rita, please put your camera on and unmute yourself. We would like to meet you.
Yes, my camera is on, ma'am. Good evening, all.
Good evening. We are not able to see you, Rita. Okay, now we can see you. Yes, Rita.
I am practicing in West Delhi.
Okay.
As obstetrician and gynecologist.
Okay.
I won second prize last quiz also.
Oh,
First
that's
and
great.
second was mine. So
Okay.
this time same sequence.
Okay, so that's really great, Dr. Rita. We are really happy that our practicing obstetricians and gynecologists are also participating in this, and that's really very encouraging. I hope that you are enjoying the AOGD bulletins.
Yeah, madam.
Yeah, lot of hard work is going behind. Dr. Rekha and her editorial team are doing a really great job. So congratulations. And
Thank you.
yeah, so you can please, your email is already available with us. So you will get your certificate and you can collect your prize from our AOGD office at Safdarjung Hospital. So it will be 2 prizes now, right?
Josna, please, if the poster winners are there, you can felicitate them also.
Yes, sure. So the third winner for today is the third winner there? Is the third winner there for today?
Is not put her name in the chat box.
Okay. Okay, so we'll, if somebody comes, it's okay. Otherwise, then, yeah. Monica, please repeat the winners for the poster.
Ma'am, you please let them know that we put their photos and brief introduction in our bulletin also.
Yes.
Those who win
You
the
tell them,
quiz.
Rekha, you tell them that is
Yeah.
your forte.
Priyanka, I hope you have seen your photograph in the last month's bulletin, this month's bulletin.
Yes, ma'am. Yes,
Yeah,
ma'am. It was
so
there.
I think that time you gave your introduction as a senior resident in Maulana Azad, but you can send me your fresh introduction. So I'll
Yes,
change
ma'am.
that. Okay. And your
Okay, ma'am.
photograph is already with me. If you want to change your photograph, you are free to do that. Okay.
Okay, ma'am.
Priyanka wants to make a hat trick, I think, now. Next
Yes.
time. Good.
And Dr. Rita, please, you can also share your fresh photograph with us with the AOGD mail, or actually, you know, for someone from AOGD will also contact you for your introduction and photograph. So you can-
Okay, so yeah, so we have to also felicitate our poster winners. So
Ma'am,
Aditi,
Shivam, can you put the phone number of the third winner in the chat box? Someone has asked for it. So maybe that person has not noted down the number. Shivam, do you have that number with you?
I think meanwhile, Kanika Chopra, Aditi, and third, second runner-up कौन था पोस्टर का? मोनिका? Second runner-up कौन है? Third कौन है पोस्टर में?
डॉक्टर सुजाता मित्तल.
तो कनिका को वीडियो कर दो ऑन शिवम. कनिका का, अदिति का इकट्ठा ही कर दो तीनों का.
Kanika, Aditi, Kanika, Aditi, and
Aditi Chawla.
Good evening, ma'am.
And Sujata Mittal.
And Dr. Sujata has left.
Okay. So
Kanika, please unmute yourself. And please switch on your video also.
Good afternoon, ma'am.
Just tell us about yourself.
Ma'am, I'm Dr. Kanika. I'm Assistant Professor, Lady Harding Medical College.
Oh, nice. Very nice.
Congratulations for your first prize in the poster competition. It was a very important activity on the occasion of World Population Day. And we are happy that even faculty did participate. That was a good sign. Congratulations once again.
Thank you, ma'am.
Aditi, can you please introduce yourself?
Yes, ma'am. Good evening, everyone. I am a second year student in VMMC in Fatachang Hospital.
okay, so congratulations, Aditi. We are very proud of you. And you have to straight away collect your certificate and prize from the AOGD office. Okay.
Thank you, ma'am. And ma'am, I would also like to thank Achla ma'am for her guidance. Like she's anytime available for her guidance.
That's, yes, they are always there for you. Okay.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Dr. Sujata.
So I think, Josna, you can thank everyone late now, and we can then.
So I think now we come to the end of the meeting, and it was a really wonderful meeting. So thank you to the Sitaram Bhartiya team for the wonderful presentations, and thank you to all our delegates who attended and all the participants who took part in the quiz. So I think we should end our meeting now.
Thank you, and really sorry, ma'am, for the technical issues. Hopefully, it shouldn't happen the next
No,
time.
but I think since the contents of the meeting was so superb, you know, the other things were all in the background. Everybody enjoyed your
We really enjoyed, as
We
usual.
also, all of us enjoyed. It was really well done. Brilliant.
I think we must thank Dr. Sunesh and Dr. Sudha Salan, who are still with us.
Yes. all our senior members. It's so encouraging to see them there taking part in the meetings. So thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you, ma'am, Dr. Sudha Salan and Dr. Sunesh Kumar. So I think we can all now leave the meeting and enjoy the tea on this rainy day.
Bye, Rekha. Thank you.
Bye. Bye. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.